There are seemingly a lot of people out there who really dislike James Corden. I know that whenever there's news about James being cast in some Hollywood production, that Twitter erupts and groans because it seems like he's in everything these days. But other than the fans online, there are also a handful of celebrities who've made their hate for James known. Today, let's talk about these stars as we count down the top 10 celebrities who hate James Corden. At number 10, Bill Maher. I'm sure we are all familiar with how outspoken Bill Maher is. He's said some things in the past that people have no doubt taken offense to, but after one comment that he made, it seems as though he's made an enemy with James Corden, and now they just don't like each other. Back in 2019, Bill made some offensive comments about weight, where he said, quote, "Fat shaming doesn't need to end, it needs to make a comeback. Some amount of shame is good. Shame is the first step in reform," end quote. When James saw this, he took the first 8 minutes of his Late Show episode to discuss the comments that Bill made, where he said, quote, "So I sat at home and I'm watching this and all I could think of was like, oh man, somebody needs to say something about this. If only there was someone with a platform who knew what it was really like to be overweight, and then I realized, oh, that's me. There's a common and insulting misconception that fat people are stupid and lazy and we're not," end quote. Bill later responded to James's criticisms of his comments, essentially telling him that he was wrong to not shame people for their appearance, but he was pretty heated. People often have opposing views, but it looks like this is a view that they won't really come out of. At number 9, Jack Allison. Jack Allison is a member of the Writers Guild of America and used to write for Jimmy Kimmel's show back in the day, so he knows his way around late night TV. So when he found out about the shady things that James was doing on his show, he had to call him out for it, and it was not pretty. According to Jack, he went to a WGA meeting for late night writers, and James showed up to said meeting to advocate for a lower pay grade for late night writers. Doesn't really sound like something to advocate for, since it's affecting people's livelihoods, right? Jack alleged that since James showed up to the meeting without any other staffers from his show, that James made that trip to the meeting just for this request. Jack also alleged that James wanted to hire writers' assistants for 13-week periods so that he didn't have to pay them as much as a full-time contractor. He didn't think that this was fair at all, and so he decided to expose James on Twitter. James fired back online saying that this was all untrue, but Jack stuck to his story. I guess he really had it out for James because of how unfairly he wanted to treat his staff, and honestly, I can't blame him. Now before I carry on with this list, I would like to take a moment to ask you guys to consider leaving a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, because it really does help the channel out and we appreciate your support. At number 8, Ricky Gervais. It's a common thing for comedians to take jabs at other comedians. It's really just part of the culture of comedy, but I feel like when it comes to Ricky Gervais and James Corden, the jabs that he makes aren't just for laughs, but there's actual hate fueling them as well. Even though they both rose to fame in similar ways, both getting their start on British television, then making their way into movies and hosting, Ricky still seems to have a distaste for James, and he makes that apparent at every moment he can by making jokes about the late night TV host. This first started back in 2009 when James portrayed Ricky on his show. I guess Ricky wasn't a fan of the way that he was played on TV because since then, he's been a little hostile towards James. One source commented on Ricky's feelings towards James when they said, quote, "Ricky is now somewhat obsessed, attacking James when his jokes fall flat and poking fun of his size," end quote. In recent years, Ricky has also made a few jabs at Corden's jokes about Harvey Weinstein as well as James's role in the movie Cats. At number 7, Ricky Whittle. Actor Ricky Whittle, best known for his roles on The 100 and American Gods, isn't a fan of James Corden after he called the late night host out for comments that he made about a show that the two of them had once starred in. Ricky used to be on a British soap opera called Hollyoaks, and back in 2000, James was a guest star on one of the episodes. Years later, when asked about his time on the show, James had nothing positive to say about it. He told sources about his experience on the show saying, quote, "I'd actually rather die than go back. It's effing awful. It just breeds all these people walking around in this chicken in a basket fame, talking about going to LA, you know?" End quote. Ricky did not appreciate the shade that James threw at the show that gave them both their start, and so he clapped back at James where he said, quote, "It's very childish that he's slating the place where he came from, the place that made him. Good luck to him, I hope he doesn't bump into us on a night out," end quote. I think it's safe to say that Ricky is not a fan at all. At number 6, Artie Lange. Comedian Artie Lange seems to have a lot to say about a handful of Hollywood stars, especially those who have been associated with Howard Stern. Artie and Howard once worked together when he served as something of a sidekick to Stern on the Howard Stern Show back in 2001 to 2009, but he was forced to leave the show due to his substance abuse issues. It seems like the comedian carried that grudge with him for a long time because he really doesn't have anything nice to say about Howard or anyone else that he's worked with. For example, James Corden. Back in 2016, during Artie's podcast called Artie Quitter, the comedian started ripping on Stern, saying that he doesn't like how his comedy has changed from being more brash and abrasive to being more celebrity friendly, but then somehow he got into ripping on James Corden as well, since he was a guest on Howard's show not too long before this episode of Artie's podcast. The comedian started making comments about James, saying, quote, "When James Corden opens his fat effing mouth to do karaoke in a car, something that wouldn't be effing funny to the secretaries at an accounting firm, and gets an Emmy for it, I'm allowed to say that he sucks," end quote. Those were some harsh words for someone who I don't think has ever been personally associated with, so I guess this is just him projecting his anger onto James, but the bottom line here is that he's certainly not a fan. At number 5, Liam Gallagher. I think that the one thing that James Corden is best known for is his carpool karaoke segment on his late night show. Over the series of episodes he's done, he's sung with everyone from One Direction to Adele to Migos and more. But even though the show reaches out to many artists, some of them have refused to participate in the segment, like Liam Gallagher, for example. Liam is the former singer for the band Oasis, and he told GQ magazine back in 2017 about how he was invited to film an episode of Carpool Karaoke with James Corden, and he flat out refused. Going more in depth into why he refused, Liam said, quote, "No thank you very much, no effing chance, mate. With that fat bloke from Kevin and Perry, James Corden is a knobhead," end quote. Clearly he doesn't like James very much, but no one really knows why. Maybe it's personal, or maybe he just doesn't like James's vibes or something. Either way, Carpool Karaoke with Oasis is never gonna happen. At number 4, Asia Argento and Rose McGowan. Sometimes it seems as though James Corden has trouble reading the room. Yes, he is a comedian, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be constantly cracking jokes, because there is an appropriate time and place for comedy, and you have to be mindful of that. James's lack of respect for the Me Too movement is the reason why Asia Argento and Rose McGowan hate James Corden so much, because after he made jokes about Harvey Weinstein at the height of his public takedown, they never saw him the same way. Back in 2017, James was hosting a black tie event for AIDS research where he did a little comedy monologue that seriously fell flat. He made several jokes about Weinstein, saying things like, quote, "This evening is so lovely that Weinstein already invited it up to his room for a massage," and, quote, "It's been a weird week, hasn't it, watching Harvey Weinstein in hot water. Ask any of the women who watch him take a bath, it's weird watching Harvey Weinstein in hot water." Two Hollywood stars who were heavily involved in exposing Weinstein for his crimes, Asia Argento and Rose McGowan, took serious offense to James's jokes, and they had some harsh words for him, calling the comedian an effing piglet and saying, quote, "Shame on this pig and everyone who grunted with him," end quote. There are just some things that you shouldn't joke about, and the situation with Weinstein was certainly one of those things. At number 3, Pierce Brosnan. You know when you meet someone who just rubs you the wrong way? Well, this is apparently how Pierce Brosnan felt about James Corden, because they had a run-in at a concert one time and it seemingly wasn't a pleasant experience. During an episode of The Late Late Show in 2017, James Corden spilled the tea about a celebrity that he thought was rude during their segment of Spill Your Guts or Fill Your Guts. That night's guest, Khloe Kardashian, asked James about his worst experience with a celebrity, and James told the viewers about a run-in that he had with Pierce at a concert while with his wife. James said, quote, "I went to see U2 and Pierce Brosnan was there with some friends, and they left halfway through the gig to go off, so me and my wife moved into this area, and literally this arm went on here and pushed me out of the way. I looked at him like that, and he didn't even glance at me," end quote. So basically, Pierce left his section for a bit and James moved in, but when Pierce got back, he shoved James out of the way. There was never really an explanation as to why Pierce shoved James, but clearly he just doesn't like the guy. You don't always have to have a reason, but I just wonder what prompted Pierce to do that. At number 2, Patrick Stewart. While at an award show back in 2010, Patrick Stewart exchanged some quips with James Corden and really dug into the way that he was presenting at the show that evening. James was hosting the 2010 Glamour Women of the Year award, and when Patrick took the stage, he took the opportunity to criticize the way James had been hosting, where he said, quote, "When the presenters are up here and when the recipients are receiving their awards, don't stand at the back of the stage with your hands in your pockets, looking around as though you wish you were anywhere but here," end quote. James tried to quip back, saying that the people accepting the awards should just hurry up. Then Patrick replied, saying, quote, "From where I was sitting, I can see your belly, and that was right there at the back of the room." To which James then replied, saying, quote, "You can see my belly and we can all see you dying right now," end quote. It was just a really messy back and forth situation, but you could kind of tell that Patrick was frustrated with James and that he just really doesn't like him very much. And finally, at number 1, Hollywood. Now I know this isn't necessarily a celebrity, but I would argue that much of Hollywood doesn't like James Corden. Though yes, he's getting booked for a lot of roles these days, a lot of movie critics have some harsh words for the comedian. One of the most recent negative criticisms that James received from a number of sources came from his performance in the movie Prom. A lot of people didn't like his portrayal of the character, and many took offense because of the way the character was played, because James seemed to have laid into a lot of gay stereotypes while in character. On top of that, James has been criticized for other roles like his character in the movie Cats, and even his hosting of the Friends reunion. There are a lot of people who think that he's just doing the absolute most in Hollywood and it's not good, so a lot of people just don't like him for that. Now before I wrap up the video, I want you guys to tell me what you guys think about James Corden. Do you like him, hate him, or feel impartial about the comedian? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Anyways, that's it for me. I've been your host, Room. Until next time, stay safe, make good choices, and stay goofy, friends. Bye!